This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of History Off the Page. Like many of you, I've been fixated by the conflict unfolding in the Ukraine over the past week. For the first time since the early 1990s, we're seeing war unfold on the streets of European cities in a way that I don't think any of us ever thought would be possible again. Even more incredibly, seemingly overnight, we find ourselves essentially back in a Cold War. This fight going on in Ukraine isn't just about Russia and Ukraine, but as we've seen, it's become a proxy for larger struggles between East and West, especially between the ideas of democracy and dictatorship. And given where we were just a few weeks ago, I have to say it's really incredible to think about the amount of lethal aid right now being delivered by NATO and the EU to Ukraine. I mean, think about this. You have states like Sweden and Switzerland and even Luxembourg that for centuries have been neutrals, stayed out of the big world wars, stayed out of the Cold War, and now they are actively taking sides in this unfolding drama in the Ukraine. We're seeing the formation of foreign legions, of people coming from France, from the United States, from Britain, Poland, the Baltic states, and they're going to Ukraine and fighting, basically, against the Russian invasion. And this is very similar, perhaps, to what happened in Spain during the 1930s. So it's pretty incredible to see this kind of playing out again in the 21st century. It looks and feels like we're in a moment after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, or even some people have said this is kind of like World War II. Before the United States got involved, we were supporting Great Britain. We were doing this thing called the Lend-Lease program. Roosevelt has this famous quote where he basically says, if your neighbor's house is on fire, right, you give him the equipment he needs to put it out. Economically speaking, too, I have to say, we are essentially at war. I mean, this is not just a couple of sanctions designed to punish a couple oligarchs here or there, but we're talking about American companies pulling out of Russia. We're talking about the blocking of Russian propaganda and media channels. We're talking about Russia being kicked out of cultural federations like FIFA, UEFA. I mean, one of the big kind of funny but not funny things that happened is that the World Judo Association withdrew their kind of honorary membership for Vladimir Putin. Right? He's a big judo fan. He pretends to be very tough. So there's all these kind of economic things that are going on, right? Boeing isn't going to be servicing Russian airplanes anymore. I just saw this morning that Aeroflot, the national Russian airline, is not going to be able to be ticketed because they've been blocked from the international ticketing system. So this is a level of kind of economic warfare in many ways that we haven't seen since the height of the Cold War. So we're living in this time period that feels like one of those moments that shapes generations. And whether or not this is 1989 and, we're about to witness the collapse of Putin's empire and dictatorship and, this is going to be a real springtime of peoples, or whether this is 1938 and this is the prelude to a much larger and much more violent and geographically widespread story that some might even call World War III. Who knows, right? It's hard to tell because we're in the middle of that moment. But I thought it would be a good idea to unpack for some of you the history behind what's going on, right? How did we get here from a historical perspective? After all, I'm a historian, and using history to understand the present is what I do best. That's partly what this whole podcast series is all about, is trying to understand how we got where we are by where we came from and the various changes and developments that led us to this place. So I want to begin today's podcast by noting that the causes of this war in Ukraine did not begin a couple weeks ago. This is not some spur-of-the-moment decision that Vladimir Putin made that maybe, had someone offered up some other piece of negotiation, had Macron just talked to Putin a little bit longer, had Joe Biden said, well, we're not going to allow Ukraine to join NATO, then maybe all of this would be different. I have bad news for you, right? There's much deeper causes that are leading to this moment, and whether it would have started back in the end of February or whether it would have started a couple weeks later or a couple weeks earlier, a lot of that is incidental compared to the larger forces that have been driving us towards this conflict. In fact, I'd argue that the short version of the story begins with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And in some ways, even though that was over 30 years ago, we are still working out, we are still negotiating and moving through the end results of the fall of communism. Now, if we want to find a way out of this situation, if we want to figure out how to solve it, how to even restore peace, perhaps, we have to understand the events that have led us to this point. I'll also say that one of the things that we want to do here is to try to understand the Russian perspective on the war. Why is it that Russians decided to do this? And I know I've seen in the media there's this kind of simplistic explanation that goes around where, how did we get here? Well, Vladimir Putin is a bad guy. He's evil. He's kind of like, Darth Vader. He just wants to take things over. And the story here is just Vlad Putin is crazy and evil, and that's it. That's all we have to know. I would agree, actually, that most of those things are true. Vladimir Putin is, trying to take over other countries. He is a man who thinks purely about power. But the fundamental element that is driving this war is that many Russians do not recognize Ukrainians as being a separate nationality. They do not recognize the Ukraine as being a different state or a different territory from Russia. If you want an analogy, if you're familiar with Spanish politics at all, you have a group of people that are from the area around Barcelona and from Barcelona. They call themselves Catalan. And many Catalans feel like they are an independent nationality. They would say, we're not Spanish. I've had many friends who are Catalan. When Spain plays in the World Cup, they actually root against the Spanish team because they say, well, Spain is the oppressor. Spain is the occupier. And of course, if you go to someone from Madrid and you say, what's a Catalan? They say, oh, there's no Catalans. It's a region. It's a dialect. It's not a different nationality. We're not going to recognize that. Right? If you want a kind of more absurd American kind of example, if you went to Texas, you could probably find some people that would say, I'm Texan first. Right? I am Texan. There was an independent nation there in Texas for a while. We're just a little bit different. And most Americans, if you said, well, what do you think of a Texan? You say, oh, Texans are Americans, of course. There's no difference. So this notion about the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians is, I would argue, at the heart of the matter. This is not some isolated viewpoint of a James Bond-like villain either. This is the way that many Russians feel and have felt for several centuries. Right? We'll talk a little bit later about the origins of Ukrainian nationalism, especially at the end of the 19th century. But we'll see that through the decades, whether you're talking about the czars, whether you're talking about people like Lenin and people like Stalin, who happens to be Georgian, but he still was kind of a greater Russian enthusiast, one could argue. There are a lot of people in Russia that, again, see the Ukraine as inherently part of Russia and have felt, even after independence, that it still is that way. In fact, one of the big problems that the Russians had, especially at the beginning of this invasion, is that ordinary Russian soldiers didn't understand why they would be fighting against Ukrainians. As one soldier said on a radio call, we don't know who to shoot at. They all look like us. You even see these stories in the news about Russian soldiers going into the first waves of the invasion, and they're on Tinder, and they're trying to set up dates with like Ukrainian women because they think, oh, we're Russians, they're Ukrainians, it's basically the same thing. We're going to be greeted as liberators. And of course, that doesn't quite work out, or it hasn't quite worked out so far. But understanding the Russian motivation here and the Russian perspective is really, really important. Just to flush this out a little bit more, one of the things that seems to have baffled American commenters is how is it that Vladimir Putin can describe what he's doing as a denazification effort? In particular, the president of Ukraine happens to be Jewish. He happens to be a democratically elected Ukrainian Jew. How can you denazify a Jewish person, right? That seems absurd. That seems like an oxymoron or mutually exclusive. In many ways, it is absurd, and I want to be perfectly clear that my sympathies are totally with President Zelensky. But as we'll see, there are historical reasons that make people in Russia see these claims by Putin as credible, that see the idea of denazifying Ukraine not as some sort of absurdity, but as actually a real thing that needs to be done because there is the belief that there are actually Nazis and fascists still in Ukraine. So we're going to unpack all of this in today's episode. But before we get into the actual history, we should note that it's not enough just to understand how we got here. We also need to understand why it matters. If I can paraphrase an American media personality, went on TV and he said, "What has Putin or Russia ever done to me? Why should any of us care what happens on the other side of the Atlantic?" Now, one could spend several podcast episodes going through all this, talking about the various history. There's basically this kind of global connection argument that many people would make where you say, what happens in Ukraine in a globalized world, it doesn't stay in Ukraine. What happens in the Baltic states, what happens in Germany, it doesn't stay there, right? Even this war, even with the United States and NATO not officially being at war, not actively participating in the war, look what's happened to gas prices. Gas prices have exploded with just these two countries going to war that seem to have nothing to do with us. Now, this global connection theory has gone by different names in different past contexts. If we were doing this podcast during the Cold War, we would probably describe it as the domino theory. Right? This is the idea that you can't allow Vietnam to become communist because if it does, then it will give communists a base to attack their neighbors. Laos will go communist. Cambodia will go communist. Thailand will go communist. And before you know it, you wake up and all of Southeast Asia is communist. If you're a member of the Greatest Generation, you might describe this as anti-appeasement. Right? We have the lesson of Hitler and Munich in 1938. Basically, the British and the French get together with the Italians and the Germans. Hitler says, all I want to do is protect my people living in the Sudetenland. And the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain says, okay, sure, we'll do that. We'll give you this territory. And then he goes home and he famously, gets off the airplane and he says, this is peace in our time. And it's peace for about 6 months before Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. So obviously there's a compelling argument here. If you allow Vladimir Putin to continue to invade countries that he deems part of his sphere of influence, where does it stop? Is Vladimir Putin going to try to retake East Germany, because he wants to relive his glory days there? We want a more kind of farcical look at this, or a more philosophical look at this. We might even call this the toddler theory of international relations. Those of you that are parents will know what I mean. If you have a toddler, and the toddler throws a fit and you give in to it, then that reinforces the idea to the toddler that whatever action they just took, they should take again. Whereas if you discipline the child, may not always work the first time, but if you discipline them, eventually they learn, okay, these are the rules. This is what I can't get away with. Now, in the context of Putin and Russia, certainly there's a lot of evidence to support this global connection theory that I've just laid out. Russia has fought aggressive wars in Chechnya in the 1990s. They attacked Georgia in 2008, and they seized Crimea in 2014. So again, the events that are going on today that we're witnessing, they're not just happening in isolation. This is part of a larger pattern and a larger process that the Russians, and in particular Vladimir Putin, have been engaged in for at least 20 years. But there's also more to understanding this moment than just geopolitics. Because one could also argue that this moment is about ideology. And not just in terms of whether you believe in a particular ideology, democracy, authoritarianism, liberalism, capitalism, etc., but whether you believe that these terms have any meaning at all. Because for at least the last 20, maybe 30 years, we've lived in a world that is increasingly defined by cynicism, by the idea that ideas and values are essentially meaningless, or maybe they're means to an ends, right? They're talking points. In this larger conflict, where really the only thing that matters is winning, or some might say power. And this sense of cynicism, it extends across national and across normal political boundaries. You'll find it on the right here in the United States, but you'll also find it in the left. You'll find it, as I just mentioned, in the United States, but it also exists in basically every democracy around the world. We live in a time period where it's very easy to say, hey, you need to see the hidden truth. Hey, I've got I can pull the curtain back and we'll see the Wizard of Oz at work here, behind everything. And social media plays a large role in this as well, right? It's very easy to amplify your voice. It's very easy to question and to kind of construct arguments that kind of make people go, I'm now suspicious. I don't know that I really believe whatever I was being told. Now, for those of us that came of age in the 1980s or 1990s, who remember the images of people tearing down the Berlin Wall, of a single man standing up to a column of tanks in Tiananmen Square in 1989, of arch enemies Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands, or Nelson Mandela being released from jail. For us, words like freedom and democracy and liberty, they seemed to carry real meaning. They were things that we truly believed in. And so for us at least, the past 20 years or so have been really hard to take. And then now, all of a sudden, somewhat amazingly, the world seems to be rallying in defense of some of those basic notions and values again. It's like we've been sliding into this dystopic future, and then boom, we have this kind of Star Wars type moment, an opportunity when the sides in this struggle are so clear and so obvious that we can agree on the need to take concrete actions to defend these ideals. So what's going on in Ukraine today isn't only about Ukraine. It's also very much about who we are and what type of society we want to have. Okay, let's get into the history of things. There's two basic versions to the story, and I want to start with the shorter version because I think that'll make more sense to most of you, and then we can start talking about the long-term historical trends that are related to what's brought us here today. The short version of how we got here begins with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I guess the most basic, easiest way that I can explain this is kind of like a breakup or even a marriage that's ending, right? So you have a marriage and the parties are not getting along and they say, okay, we want to do a separation. And one of the parties in the separation says, okay, I'm free now. We can see other people. We can do our own thing. We have independence. The other party says, no, we're taking some time off, but basically we still want to be together. We're still going to make this relationship work. Of course, we're not going to see other people. Why would we do that? And so in this kind of example that I'm giving you, the Ukrainians are the ones that are kind of looking at the idea of independence. The Ukrainians are the ones that are sort of saying, yeah, we'd like a good relationship with Russia. They're our neighbors. There's historical, ethnic, cultural connections. But we're also open to seeing kind of other people or other nations. We also feel a sort of sense of being European, not just Russian. And so we have an identity that exists outside of a Russian connection. For Russians, this is not the story. The story is that Ukrainians are essentially a form of Russian. There is no daylight between the two. And so how could Ukraine have independent thoughts if it's really a part of Russia? This has essentially been the relationship between Ukraine and Russia since 1991. Now, inside of Ukraine, various politicians at times have felt more pro-Russian, more pro-sort of Western or European, but they occupy a pole somewhere on that line. Even as the Soviet Union is breaking up in 1991, the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, is trying to kind of maneuver a spot where Ukraine is aligned with Russia, but it has some room for autonomy, some room for it to make decisions on its own. Now, another thing that's influenced this relationship is the internal politics of Ukraine, where you not only have this kind of back and forth between do we want to be Eastern versus Western, but you also have a tension between do we want to be a democracy or do we want autocracy? Do we want some sort of quasi-dictatorship, right, where you have a very, very strong president, kind of like Vladimir Putin, right, who is in control of society, who is in control of the economy, who is working with oligarchs to kind of centralize power. And so over time, Vladimir Putin has kind of developed a natural affinity for the autocrats, there's a kind of natural alliance there, just as there is with the idea of democratically aligned Ukrainians with Europe. And so you have this kind of back and forth that's played out, as I said, over the course of 30 years. However, there are two moments where this kind of back and forth, these tensions, have really flared up into violence and actually into revolutions. And the first one of these moments happened in the late fall, early winter of 2004. And it's known as the Orange Revolution. Basically, Kuchma was very unpopular by this point. He decides he's not going to run for re-election. And so the two main candidates that emerge are a guy named Viktor Yushchenko and a guy named Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Yushchenko was a former banker who had been a member of the opposition, and he wanted a more balanced approach between Europe and Russia. He's seen as more pro-democratic. He's seen as more pro-Western, more European. Yanukovych, on the other hand, was a former governor of the Donetsk region. The Donetsk region is basically in the eastern part of Ukraine, very close to Russia. It's where some of these separatist regions are today. And so it's not surprising then that Yanukovych was openly more pro-Russian. Although Yanukovych did initially say, I also want Ukraine to join the EU someday. Economically, that's where the sweet spot's at. Economically, Ukraine has to be tied to the broader European economy because that's where the money is, that's where the future is. Now, Yanukovych was also a convicted criminal. He doesn't really have a lot of charisma, and he's not very popular outside of the Donbass in the east. But he is supported by Russia, and Russian media is very popular, is very strong in the Ukraine, right? If you speak Ukrainian, you can understand Russian pretty easily. And so you get this election in, again, November 2004. It's very close. And in the end, they say Yanukovych was announced as the winner very narrowly for the presidential election. However, exit polls taken by international organizations show that actually Yushchenko should have won. They find evidence of widespread fraud in the Donbass. And so protesters then will take over the central square in Kyiv known as the Maidan. There's basically kind of a stalemate that happens. The two sides start to negotiate. They say, okay, we'll run the election again, only we'll modify basically the role of the president to make them sort of less powerful. So that way, if Yanukovych loses, at least it's not going to be as powerful. The new president will be kind of limited a little bit. And so that's basically what they do. The Ukrainian Supreme Court nullifies the election. They say run it again in December. And this time Yushchenko wins fairly comfortably. Now we're doing, again, the short version of the story here, so there's a lot of detail that I want to skip over. But you can imagine that the reaction in Russia is fairly hostile to this, right? Here was this election. You had a clear favorite. You thought your favorite had won. And then all of a sudden, protesters take over and nullify the election. And now the guy you didn't want to win is in power. This moment also doesn't just happen in isolation. There are other revolutions going on across the world, but especially in Europe, a place like Serbia, which had very close relations with Slobodan Milosevic. He is overthrown. And so this leads the Russians to conclude not that, well, there was this election and yeah, we were cheating, but you caught us. So, okay, no harm, no foul. This leads them to conclude that the Cold War is essentially still going on and that the United States and Europe are fighting it through alternate means. That the West is now pursuing politics not by military attacks or not even by sort of overt politics or economics, but that they're going to subtly try to arrange and mess with elections and nullify elections and use the cover of democracy to seize power in satellite states. Now, Vladimir Putin was never really much of a Democrat. He was never much of someone that believed in the ideals of democracy. But for Putin, increasingly after 2004, democracy becomes seen not as this kind of ideal, not as this system, not as this way of conflict resolution, a way to establish social harmony, but for him, it becomes a weapon of war. And so he will increasingly turn towards supporting autocrats and towards trying to undermine democratic governments after 2004. In Russia itself, they keep the kind of facade of democracy, but he will also take steps within Russia itself to consolidate increasing amounts of power. Now, had things been left alone at this point, 2004, who knows what would have happened? But Yushchenko's government, Yushchenko being the pro-Western guy who comes into power after the Orange Revolution in 2004, Viktor Yushchenko's government was not successful. One of the big events that I think we've kind of forgotten about now was the global financial crisis in 2008. And so it creates all of these economic problems. They're experienced in Europe as well as in the United States, but especially also in Ukraine. And so in 2010, there's another presidential election. Guess who's back? It's Viktor Yanukovych. This time, for those of you that are interested in American politics, he hires this slick American political consultant by the name of Paul Manafort. They clean up Yanukovych's image. They make him seem like he's this kind of competent business manager type guy. And this time, without cheating, Yanukovych wins. Now, once he's in power, Yanukovych immediately begins to move in an autocratic direction. They take over the Constitutional Court. They start making illegal modifications to the Constitution. He starts following kind of Putin's playbook about economic consolidation. In terms of foreign policy, Yanukovych will also move the Ukraine closer to Russia. One of the big kind of debates that had come out of the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union was what would happen to the Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet was dating back even before the Soviet Union. It was like sort of the pride of the Russian Navy, right? So the Black Sea Fleet, it's one of the most successful kind of Russian military units even before, again, the Soviet Union. And it's based in a place called Sevastopol in the Crimean Peninsula. So as the Soviet Union is breaking up, the Russian Federation wants control of the Black Sea Fleet. The Ukrainians want to kind of divide it a little bit. But even if you give the fleet to Russia, they have to have a place to put it. And so the question about what would happen to this naval base is one that had plagued Ukrainians since the moment of the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Well, what does Viktor Yanukovych do? He renews the lease for the base of Crimea in 2012, which is one of the reasons that the Russians were able to take it so easily. He also passes a controversial language law. He says regions have the right to make Russian an official language of the state of Ukraine. But it's in the area of economics that the most important sort of development occurs. Basically, as we had seen, Ukraine had talked about the idea of joining the EU. Ukraine saw its future destiny, economically speaking, linked to Europe proper. For Russia, it became apparent that the EU was not something that Russia was ever really going to be a part of or wanted to be a part of. And so they start trying to develop their own counterweight to that, which becomes known as the Eurasian Customs Union, which is formed in 2010 between Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. So the Russians are pressuring Ukraine to join it. The Russians will start offering Yanukovych incentives. Join us, we'll give you payments, we'll lower your gas prices, we'll do a deal, right? This will pull Ukraine almost permanently into the Russian orbit. Now, it's unclear how much Yanukovych favored one side versus the other. In the end, right, we still have the legacy of the financial crisis. Ukraine was facing a debt crisis at the time. And so he starts trying to kind of negotiate with the two and play the two off each other. Another big thing that comes up is Yanukovych's main political opponent is this woman, Yulia Tymoshenko, and he actually has her arrested on some trumped-up charges. And so the EU is kind of trying to play a hardball with him to get him to release her, to try to move Ukraine back more towards democracy. So basically, the two sides are going back and forth. He's trying to play them off against each other. But then he finally announces in late November 2013, we are going to make a decision. Either we're joining the EU or we're not. And so he kind of paints himself into this corner. And then by the time you get to late November 2013, he realizes Russia is offering kind of immediate benefits to me, long-term benefits to me. The EU, not so much. I'm going to go with Russia. And so he comes out and he announces Ukraine will not sign what's called the association agreement with the EU. This would basically start to move Ukraine on a path towards becoming a candidate member for the European Union. Now, I'm not going to go into a blow-by-blow history of the Euromaidan revolution, which is what's coming. There's a lot of ebb and flow to it. There are moments when these protesters seem to really have momentum. There are moments when it seems like it's past. There's only a couple hundred protesters on that Euromaidan square again. But basically, Yanukovych will decide to crack down on them. On February 20th, 2014, police opened fire on protesters at the square, killing about 70 people and injuring over 500. The results of this event shocked the nation, and several of Yanukovych's most ardent supporters, including most importantly his security forces, many of them begin to abandon him. Yanukovych was scheduled actually to leave Kyiv right after this, so he had a trip that was already planned. He decides to go on the trip, and then because he's leaving, it makes it seem like he's fleeing. And so if you were a Yanukovych supporter and you think, he's not staying in the capital, he's not going to fight this out, you start to think, okay, the revolution is upon us again. And this is basically what happens. The opposition takes control of the Ukrainian parliament and declares Yanukovych deposed. He famously flees to Russia. Protesters will go into his giant mansion that he built. He had this kind of enormous, almost palace. So it's this amazing incident, and now twice in the span of a decade, a pro-Russian politician has been overthrown and replaced by one that will be more pro-Western. Now, this moment in 2014 does not catch the Russians by surprise. Quite the opposite. They are in some ways already prepared for it in a way that they were not in 2004. And so one of the consequences of the overthrow of Yanukovych is the seizure of Crimea. On February 20th, 2014, as violence is breaking out in Kyiv, protests also break out in Crimea, some for, some against the idea of the Maidan Revolution. 1 week later, 60 heavily armed men will seize the parliament and the Council of Ministry buildings on the peninsula, raising Russian flags. Members of Yanukovych's security services actually seize key crossing points on the peninsula, and a Russian warship will actively block access to the peninsula by sea. And so this is the moment that you have what are called little green men. So all these sort of strange green men, or they're dressed all in green, they show up and they start seizing local airports. They depose the prime minister, and they suddenly elect this new, very, very pro-Russian prime minister of the Crimean region. Now, on March 1st, this new prime minister, whose name is Sergei Aksyonov, asks for Russian intervention. Russian forces proceed to occupy the rest of the peninsula, and after a hastily arranged referendum on March 17th, the Crimean parliament requests annexation into Russia. On March 18th, they actually sign this treaty, and the Russians will occupy Crimea. The following month in April, you have similar incidents that happen in Luhansk and Donetsk, and then these become the breakaway regions which kind of triggered the current war that we're witnessing today. When Putin is coming in and talking about protecting ethnic Russians in the Donbass, this is what he's talking about, these territories that were seized in April of 2014. This basically brings us up to the eve of the current crisis. Russia looks at the overthrow of Yanukovych as illegitimate. The U.S. looks at the annexation of Crimea as illegitimate. The West, of course, imposes some sanctions. They don't really have a lot of teeth. The Russians are not impressed. The biggest thing, actually, is that the United States and Europe kick Russia out of the G8. The G8 was this group of the largest 7 economies in the world, plus, and then Russia was invited to join in 1998. And for Russians, it was a symbol of, you are not going to be left out of this global order that we're creating. The global order is not being created against you, but you are a part of it. You are helping to shape it as well. But as we've seen, these sanctions don't really have much of an effect outside of Ukraine. Inside of Ukraine, the 2014 seizure of Crimea begins to shift public opinion away from Russia. Even people that are ethnically Russian, even people that are born in Russia and moved to Ukraine, but think of themselves primarily as Russian, they are not really okay with this, and they start to have sympathies towards the idea of joining NATO. Right? The idea of Ukraine being a part of NATO is kind of reawakened, if you will, by the 2014 invasions. And we'll get into the history of NATO later in the podcast. But what we want to note here is basically the conditions of war are completely set. This moment in 2014 was basically a ceasefire. Very little has changed in the last 8 years, to diffuse these basic tensions that orient the crisis. So again, I mentioned this before, the idea that, had only, the NATO come out with some sort of statement, the idea that, maybe if they had been more conciliatory, this was always going to happen, at least since 2014. And I think the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian military was very much aware that this was eventually what was going to happen. Okay, so that was the short version of events. In the second half of our podcast episode today, I want to comment on some of the deeper issues in history that have led us to the current crisis. Sometimes I think we have a tendency to settle, as I mentioned before, on these kind of simplistic explanations that kind of make it very easy, make it very black and white, and we just kind of say, well, the other side is wrong, our side is right, good and evil, that's all we need to know. And I say this as someone who has studied the Balkan Wars intensively and who lived through the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, when the causes of the breakup of Yugoslavia basically got boiled down to this idea of ethnic hatred. There were these experts that were saying, Bosnians, Serbs, Croats, they hate each other. They've always hated each other. They're backwards. They're bloodthirsty. This was just a matter of time until they just started trying to slaughter each other again. If you've ever been to the region, you know how absurd that kind of statement is. Yes, there are people in the Balkans who are radical nationalists. There are people that would look at genocide as being something that they would like to participate in again, who remember the Second World War and are eager to have a sort of sequel to it so that they can get revenge. But the vast majority of the people that you'll meet in the Balkans will say, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, there's not a huge difference between them. It's more or less the same. If I can use a great phrase that I picked up in Thailand once, same, but different. And so it's important, again, for policymakers, for people trying to understand what's going on, we have to push past these oversimplistic interpretations of what's going on. We have to get into the deep history in order to understand it. So as we get into this second part of the podcast, one of the things that I'm going to try to do is to help you understand the Russian perspective on how we got here. And not just the immediate kind of moments of Yanukovych and Yushchenko and that sort of thing, but the deep history of Russia, the deep history that makes Putin's propaganda so effective inside of the Russian Federation. Now, I also want to be 100% clear here. I am 100% sympathetic to the Ukrainians in this conflict. But it is important that we understand, again, the Russian perspective, because that's where Russian motivations are coming from. So we're going to unpack all this, as I said, over the second part of our podcast today. Now, I think the place to start here is, again, with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I think one of the things that we, as people living in the West, have really struggled to understand is the way that Russians processed the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. For us, the answer was always very clear, right? The USSR existed, there was the Cold War, capitalism versus communism, and what happens? Communism fails spectacularly. Whether you're talking about communist politics, whether you're talking about the command economy, whether you're talking about even some of its cultural programs, right? The end of communism in the Soviet Union and in Russia is people standing in line for hours just trying to buy bread. It's the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in 1986, right? What is communist science? It's a disaster. It's shortcuts. It's poor planning. You watch the HBO series on Chernobyl. It's built on lies. And so for us, it's very clear what happens. Communism is dead. Move on. Game over. For people living in Eastern Europe, for the most part, it's very similar. The fall of communism in 1989, in many cases, it's not violent. There really isn't kind of an overthrow. It just kind of votes itself out of existence in a number of these countries like Hungary. But for ordinary Russians, this experience is a little bit different. Yes, communism collapses, faith in the Soviet Union collapses. Mikhail Gorbachev goes from being this powerful leader of the most powerful party in one of the most powerful countries in the world. And a couple years later, he's literally doing Pizza Hut commercials. But again, for ordinary Russians, there's more to this story. And one of the parts of the story is not that Russia collapses as a superpower, right? In fact, they still see Russia as a superpower, as a great power. There is no clear defeat. that exposes Russia as a country that should no longer be a great power. In fact, if you want to think about the history of what happens in 1991, less as the collapse of the Soviet Union and more as the reemergence of Russia, that's probably how a lot of Russians would explain what happened today. And this is a really key point, because when we think about great powers and what happens after the defeat of great powers, there are a couple different historical models. The model that I think most Americans and most Europeans thought had occurred in 1991 was the model of Germany and Japan after World War II. Right? Basically, Germany and Japan are so devastated by the results of World War II, by the kind of, fascism made these promises, and look what happened. It was almost apocalyptic. This is discredited. This isn't worth following. This makes promises, but they don't bear out. What we need is the liberal democracy that succeeded in Britain, in the United States, in France, in other places in the world. We think about other great powers that fell not necessarily directly through wars where you have occupations. Think about something like the British and French empires. Right? The French Empire is basically broken in Vietnam and then later on in Algeria in a series of colonial wars. The British Empire is broken in many ways, one could argue, by the Suez Crisis in 1956. So there are these moments when these countries or these empires learn, okay, we are no longer as powerful as we once were. The other model of history, and the one that unfortunately is probably more appropriate to apply to Russia after 1991, is what happened to Germany after World War I. Yes, Germany lost World War I. The Kaiser abdicated, the political system changed, but a lot of Germans never felt like they were defeated. Right? They even invent this stab in the back myth to kind of say, look, it's not that the German army lost, it's that we were undermined from within. So if you look at the history of the breakup of the Soviet Union, in 1991, the Soviet Union is essentially pulled apart by the leaders of its member states, especially the leader of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin doesn't do this because he's Alex Navalny, because he's some sort of democratic reformer, because he believes in liberal democracy. He's not some kind of Václav Havel or Lech Walesa. Instead, what Yeltsin is trying to do is basically just to gain power. And so he needed a mechanism to be able to defy Mikhail Gorbachev, and that becomes the Russian state. So again, for Russians, Russian greatness is never discredited. Russian power politics, great power politics, is never discredited. And I can't stress to you enough how much this goes beyond Vladimir Putin. Clearly, Vladimir Putin is not willing to accept that Russia is not what it once was. But it goes beyond Putin. Consider even in February 1993, when relations between the West and Russia were at their best since World War II, you still have Boris Yeltsin saying Russia has a special role to play as the guarantor of peace in the states of the former USSR. In 1994, the Russian foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, put the matter more directly, and this is a quote, "The only policy with any chance of success is one that recognizes the equal rights and mutual benefits of partnership for both Russia and the West, as well as the status and significance of Russia as a world power. Russian foreign policy has to be an independent and assertive nature." Later on, he adds that, quote, "Russia is predestined to be a world power," end quote. This is not the words of Vladimir Putin. This is not the words of someone who is anti-Western, who dreams of resurrecting the old Soviet Union. These are the words of people that are as pro-Western as you can get in Russia. Right? There is no recognition that Russia itself is no longer a great power. Now, if those words strike you as overly aggressive and chauvinistic, I totally get it. But consider again the Russian perspective, where you have Americans talking for many years about the notion of American exceptionalism, about things like the Monroe Doctrine, about the idea that America is here to bring democracy to the world, and we don't just do that by, hanging out in America and making Hollywood films, but we do that by intervening abroad to protect and to defend human rights, democracies, liberalism in a kind of classical sense. Russians also looked at the experiences of the Cold War, when you have NATO and the United States that are actively intervening in other countries, right? We are fighting proxy wars in places like Vietnam, places like Grenada, places like Panama. Now, of course, one of the big events post-1991 that Russians love to talk about when they try to frame the West and NATO as hypocritic are the Yugoslav wars. Right? The breakup of Yugoslavia becomes very messy, becomes genocidal in some aspects. There's ethnic cleansing going on. And so one of the things that NATO does, first in 1995, but then even more so in 1999, is they bomb Serbia. Serbia was basically involved in this conflict over a territory or region called Kosovo. Kosovo is about 90% ethnically Albanian, so it's very different, ethnically speaking, than Serbia proper. But Kosovo is where the most important site for Serb nationalists exist. Basically, there's this battlefield called Kosovo Polje. This is where a battle was fought in 389. And if you follow the mythology of it, Serb nationalists would say that's where Serbia begins. That's where Serbia was born. So how could you have the heart of the Serb world, the heart of the Serb nation, occupied by ethnic Muslims? So I don't have time to get into the whole story. Basically, there's violence that goes on. Both sides are kind of fighting at each other. The Serbs have obviously a lot more force that they can bring to bear. So then NATO basically decides to bomb to try to get the Serbs to back off and to recognize Kosovar autonomy. Now, the Russians in this story initially support the international community. They're concerned about, especially in Bosnia, the idea of genocide. But by 1999, they feel a close attraction to the Serbs. They feel a desire to defend the Serbs, and they are not comfortable with the idea of these bombings that take place. And so this is one of the first moments that the international consortium that Russia and the United States and Europe are all going to kind of be part of the same team. This is one of the first moments where that starts to fracture in 1999. Of course, the second and probably more important example was the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was, of course, led by the United States and to some extent the UK. Russia, as well as several European countries, were not really in favor of this invasion. They didn't necessarily authorize it. But the United States is a great power. The United States decided that it was going to intervene, and it did so. And so for someone like Vladimir Putin, they would say, wait a minute, why is it that the West gets to intervene and get rid of Saddam Hussein if they don't like him, but we can't do the same to Zelensky? Now, let me be clear. I do not agree that the NATO interventions in Yugoslavia or the U.S. invasion in Iraq are analogous to what's going on in Ukraine. But the key thing to note is that many Russians do. And you can see how propaganda attempts to accuse Ukrainians of genocide in the Donbass or in Crimea are designed to kind of draw out these moral equivalencies and to authorize these kind of connections in the minds of the Russians that are hearing them. Okay, so a second big question here is, why Ukraine? What makes Ukraine any different from any other territories that Putin could have invaded, Putin could try to take over? How is it that someone like Vladimir Putin can justify the current invasion by stating something like, Ukraine has no right to exist? When we hear Ukraine has no right to exist, we hear the words or the voice of Adolf Hitler. That sounds very, very Nazi-like. So how do you say that, but at the same time you're also saying you're going to denazify Ukraine, but you're also saying that it has no right to exist? In order to answer this question, we need to delve back deeply into history. We need to examine the entanglements that have bound these two nations together for over 1,000 years. The story goes back to the origins of the Russian and Ukrainian nations, both in terms of their actual histories and especially their mythologies. In essence, both groups basically, and the Belarusians are here as well. This is why Belarus is so closely tied to Russia in the current conflict. All three of these countries basically trace their origins back to the 9th century. When you have this group of Viking warriors known as the Rus, they unite with this Slavic tribe that's nearby to create this kind of state called the Kievan Rus. Now, how important the Viking element to all this was is debated, but the key thing is that over the course of the next centuries, they build this powerful state that rules over much of the eastern part of Eastern Europe. Kiev becomes their capital, and it stretches all the way up to Novgorod, which is one of the more northern kind of Russian cities. Now, this state begins to decline in the 12th century. Eventually, in 1223, the Mongols will come along. The Mongols conquer many things. They completely wipe out the Kievan Rus. But the legacies of that state remain. To the north, there is this little principality called Muscovy. And as the Mongols begin to withdraw, they gradually fill that power vacuum. They will begin to take on more and more territory. So you can already see here why Russians assume a natural connection to Ukrainians. The western part of modern-day Ukraine was taken over by Lithuania, and then in 1569 was transferred to Poland.
The eastern part, basically, it's a little bit complicated, but what they end up doing is looking to the Grand Dukes of Muscovy for protection. They begin to swear allegiance to him, and then basically over the course of the next century or so, the Grand Dukes of Muscovy will increasingly gain control and strengthen their control over that territory. And part of the way that they do that is to stop describing themselves just as being the Grand Dukes of Muscovy, but they start basically saying, we are the emperor of all the Russians. All the Russians are the people who trace their ancestry back to those Kievan Rus. And so already by the 17th century, we start to see Muscovy kind of trying to claim itself as being larger than just another state. Another part of this story is in 1721, Peter the Great will actually change the name of the country from Muscovy to Russia. Getting back to Ukraine,
It's here, in the context of Eastern Orthodoxy and the culturally Greek Christians being ruled over by Catholic Poles, that you start to find the first seeds of a separate Ukrainian identity. Now, we do want to be careful, because people before really the 19th century don't really put a lot of stake in national identities. What it means to be Ukrainian, what it means to be a resident of Lviv, probably means more in terms of local identity than it does national identity. Skipping over some additional history, in the middle of the 17th century, there's a rebellion by proto-Ukrainian Cossacks against Poland, and they turn to the Russian czars for support. The end result was the annexation of large amounts of land to Russia, and more importantly, and I can't stress this enough, Kievan churchmen, what we would basically call Ukrainian churchmen, but they're based in Kiev, they begin to embrace the idea of being participants in the Russian state. And I really can't stress enough how important this religious connection is. One of the things about Muscovy that makes Russians feel like it's more than just another state, another power, but is an actual great power, is this religious connection, is the idea that Muscovy is basically the third Rome. That we had Rome, where Christianity flourished and was spread throughout the empire. Rome fell and kind of the center of Christendom moved to Byzantium. And then during the medieval period, Byzantium also kind of began to wane. And so its power and its authority were transferred to Moscow. In the 17th and 18th centuries, these churchmen from Kiev helped build this narrative that the initial Rus' legacy has passed on to Moscow, that the roots of the Russian nation and the roots of the Ukrainian nation, that those are all together in these Kievan Rus in the hills of Kiev in the 9th and 10th centuries. Territorially speaking, this idea of Ukraine then gets extended during the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century. But already what we've seen is that as Russian nationalism is being developed, as it's starting to emerge, the Ukrainian nationalism is not emerging as a separate identity. In fact, it is being woven into the same story, into the same narrative. Okay, so far we have what seems like a happy marriage. But things began to change in the middle of the 19th century as an independent idea of Ukrainian nationalism began to emerge. Now, I mentioned before that the Russian state basically conquers most of what is today Ukraine. There is one small exception to this, and that is this little part of the what is today Ukraine, where Lviv is. This was actually part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so in the 19th century, one of the things that happens in Austria, or Austria-Hungary after 1867, is that people become increasingly conscious of their national belonging. People start thinking more and more in terms of being German, Polish, Czech, Hungarian. That starts to matter to them more than whatever sort of medieval or early modern feudal relationship they had to the emperor or to the king. And one of the things that happens with nationalism is it tends to spread, right? So if I am not nationalistic, but my neighbor is, then I tend to start to think in those terms as well. And over the course of time, I'll become kind of nationalistic. So we have in the first half of the 19th century, the very first beginnings of a Ukrainian nationalism that defines itself as separate from Russian nationalism. Now in 1863, there is an uprising in the Russian part of Poland. It is brutally suppressed by the czars, but it makes a kind of contrast for the czars very clear. The czars begin to say, look, even though all these peoples are my subjects and they may be different nationalities, they may have different languages, that is dangerous. And so what we need to do is Russification. We need to convince people of the glory of Russian culture, of the centrality of Russian culture. We want them to become Russians in effect. To carry this policy out, the czars will now actively begin repressing the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian nationalism. After 1863, Ukrainian nationalism is officially viewed as kind of Polish subversion. The Tsar famously declares that the Ukrainian language, quote, has not, does not, and cannot exist. In 1876, this thing called the Ems Decree bans the publication of Ukrainian texts. And again, they're trying to funnel the idea of Ukrainian nationalism into an idea of a broader kind of Russian or Greater Russian, East Slavic nationalism or identity. So again, you have nationalism being suppressed in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. You have it being grown in the Austro-Hungarian sector of what is today modern Ukraine. In 1898, for example, it's here in Lviv that the first history of the Ukrainian Rus was published that did not have them as part of the Russian nation. It provided an alternative historical narrative of the origins of the Ukrainian people. So what we have by the end of the 19th century is essentially multiple understandings of what it meant to be Ukrainian. Some who felt it was a form of Little Russian, kind of a brotherhood, if you will, being in the same family, in the same nuclear family. Some who felt it was more like being a cousin, right? We have close ties, we're related, but sometimes we might have different interests and we might go in different directions. And then, of course, it's also worth noting, there are large amounts of people that to be Ukrainian, to be Russian, these are academic ideas, right? You live in a small village or a farm, it doesn't matter much, right? The idea of being Jewish or Orthodox or Catholic, that matters a lot. But what does it mean to be Ukrainian? In 1900, it's complicated, right? There aren't clear and singular answers. Now, for many years, these differing ideas of Ukrainian nationality coexist. They're blocked from kind of getting any hegemony by the states that rule over them. But then you have World War I. And the effect of World War I is that the political control of big states all falls apart. And so when this happens, in February of 1917, you start to have the emergence of the first real independent, political, explicitly Ukrainian nationalist entity. In mid-March 1917, they create something called the Centralna Rada, which is formed in Kyiv, which basically supports the Russian provisional government, but does so with the idea of autonomy. So, yeah, we're with you, we're on the same side, we want to be part of the same state, but we are going to have some degree of autonomy in independence within the Ukraine. After the Bolshevik coup in October 1917, this Centralna Rada declares independence. Now, the Bolsheviks are watching this. The Bolsheviks are also trying to exploit Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian sentiments, and so they will set up their own Ukrainian government, their own Ukrainian Soviet. And so to make a long story again very short, these sides are going to fight back and forth with each other. There's actually kind of an anarchist guy who also gets involved in the fighting. So these are known as the Greens. There's a Russian civil war going on at this point. So in addition to, which side are the Ukrainians on or which Ukrainian sides are fighting each other, you've got the what are known as the whites. These are people that want to kind of restore the monarchy. They want a Russia that is non-communist. You have the Red Army running around So it's complicated. There's a lot of violence. The Germans and the Poles are also kind of involved. And so again, in the end, it's just a kind of a big mess. There's lots of histories, lots of regimes that can be remembered as either legitimate or illegitimate. And this is a big deal, right? When we're talking about historical memory, we like to have things that we can reach back on and say, okay, that exemplifies what we're talking about. These Ukrainians in the Centralna Rada, they exemplify the first free and national and independent Ukraine. Or we can look back at them and say, look, there are crimes going on, there's violence going on. This shows us the danger of Ukrainian nationalism. In the end, of course, the Soviets end up winning. The Red Army wins. And the Ukrainian Soviet Republic becomes one of the founders of the USSR in 1922. Now, I want to pause our narrative here because what happens next is incredibly important to understanding the stakes and the framing of the current invasion of Ukraine. One of the things that doesn't really seem to make sense to us, again, is how can Vladimir Putin try to sell this invasion as an attempt to be anti-fascist, as an attempt to denazify the Ukraine? What does he mean when he says we're going to denazify or demilitarize Ukraine? If anything, he's the one that seems like the fascist coming in, destroying, killing innocent lives. So why would any Russian buy this narrative? On the other hand, another element of the story that is playing out during the current invasion of Ukraine today that really surprises us is how surprised the Russians seem to be at the level of resistance. You know, the Russians, as I said, they came in, they thought, okay, we'll just march in, it'll last a couple days, there'll be very little fighting. The people are clearly on the side of Russia. So how is it that the Russians could have gotten that so wrong? How is it that they could have so badly underestimated the level of resistance and the will of the Ukrainian people to fight? The answer to both of these questions lies in the experience of the 1930s and 1940s, and unfortunately both are related to genocide. So let's start with the Ukrainian side of things. This has its origins basically in two developments that happened under communism. The first is that, like most other Russians, the Bolsheviks never really saw the Ukrainians as legitimately being a separate nationality. Most of them, including Joseph Stalin, who is Georgian, are kind of, again, Russophiles. They believe in this idea of greater Russian culture, and they look at Ukrainians and say, you guys are really Russians. Yes, you have some dialects, you have some words that are different maybe, you pronounce things with a little bit, different stress on them, but you're basically Russians. Both Lenin and Stalin explicitly identified Ukrainian nationalism as being anti-communist, even though they both did briefly support it in the early 1920s when they're trying to win the civil wars, they're trying to bring communism to Russia. They said, okay, we'll look past this for a little bit. In the late 1920s, Stalin orders the explicit arrest, assassination, expulsion, repression of Ukrainian intellectuals. They go after members of Ukrainian nationalist societies. They go after professors. They go after lawyers, doctors, right? It's not just people who are actively promoting Ukrainian nationalism in the sense that they're standing on the street corner yelling out, we're Ukrainians first. They are going after the kind of the core of the people that practice Ukrainian nationalism. One of the things that you see during this moment in the late 1920s, there's a whole bunch of these show trials. They'll arrest people and they'll accuse them of horrific crimes. One of the crimes that they get accused of is being Ukrainian nationalist. So this repression of Ukrainian nationalism, it's not something that's just invented by Vladimir Putin. It's something that had been going on and was instrumental to the foundation of the USSR in the late 1920s, early 1930s. The second reason that there's such hostility, even today, to the idea of a Russian takeover is related to the Bolsheviks' attempt to industrialize Russia from above during the late 1920s, early 1930s. Basically, again, I'm making a very, very long story short. One of the things that happens is that they are going to start building lots of factories. They're going to start, sending people to the cities to be able to work in the factories. You have to be able to feed them. And so where are you going to get the food in order to be able to feed the people in the cities? Communism practices a command economy. Communism, the economy is, again, controlled from above. And so one of the things that they begin to push is this idea of what's called collectivization. If you're a farmer, they would argue farmers do much better when they're controlled by the state, when they share the land among all the people, and when it's kind of, again, directed from above. They also see an element of class warfare that they can introduce into the countryside. So you don't have working class people. There's no bourgeoisie. There's no factory owners that are out in the countryside in the steppe. But what they do is they kind of sell the notion that wealthy peasants are evil, wealthy peasants are taking advantage of poorer peasants. And so there's a kind of element to class warfare. Let's all get together and let's go after these people, which they call kulaks. Now, as you might imagine, this idea of collectivizing agriculture, it doesn't work very well. In fact, it's pretty bad. And the late 1920s, early 1930s, globally speaking, this is not a good time to be in agriculture. Right in the United States, this is the period of the Dust Bowl. Now, Stalin's reaction to the lack of grain production is not to say, oh, okay, I made a mistake. I expected too much. We need to dial back on it. But it's one of the inherent problems of totalitarian systems. When you get to a totalitarian state, the leader and the ideology can never be wrong. And so if Joseph Stalin ordered something and it didn't come out the way he wanted to, the answer must be that it was sabotaged. And so one of the things that the Russians start doing, and when I say the Russians, I mean the Soviets more generally, but they're obviously dominated by ethnic Russians. One of the things that they start doing is they start repressing and cracking down on these peasants who are not meeting these grain standards. If you're in a village and your village didn't produce enough grain, they will literally seal off the village. They will arrest the leaders. They will shoot them in some cases. Sometimes they just exile them. But by the time you get to late 1932, early 1933, we are talking about massive and widespread famine. And this famine doesn't just occur everywhere across Russia, but is particularly strong in the Ukraine. Basically, Stalin looks at Ukrainians and says, I don't trust them. I see these peasants out there. They are suspect. They are anti-communist. They're nationalist. Let's just eliminate a bunch of them. Who cares if they starve to death? They're enemies of the revolution. They're enemies of communism. You've got to break some eggs if you want to make an omelet. And so part of what happens, again, in that winter of 32 to 33 in the Soviet Union, but in particular in Ukraine, is massive starvation. We're talking estimates of 5 to 7 million people dying, starving, and their government basically turning a blind eye. There are reports in the 1930s, there is plenty of grain in silos in the Ukraine. But those grains are used as a reserve. It's kept in reserve in case of war, and the idea of massive famine is not treated as an emergency. This moment in history is known as the Holodomor. It is analogous to the Holocaust, and it is directed by Soviets against Ukrainians. But of course, the vast majority of these Soviets are ethnic Russians. Now, when this is going on, you are not allowed to acknowledge that it is taking place. There are attempts by Western governments, for example, to offer supplies, to offer grain to the Soviets to help keep these people alive. And Stalin says basically, no thank you. We don't need it. There's no starvation. This is a lie. This is a myth. Don't worry about it. After the end of the Holodomor, people are still not allowed to talk about this in the Ukraine until after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The question of the Holodomor in Ukrainian national memory is one that is incredibly charged with contemporary politics. If you are a Ukrainian who is pro-Russian, you do not want people talking about the Holodomor. By contrast, if you're someone who is pro-European, you want Ukraine to move in a European direction, you want to remember the Holodomor. You want to expose people to this history, to talk about this memory and the legacy of what happened. In 2013, I had an opportunity to visit Kyiv, and one of the things that I found there was this museum dedicated to the Holodomor. And I talked to the director of the museum, and she said something that I thought was fascinating. She said, when we have a pro-Russian government, they basically cut all our funding. And when we have a pro-Western government, then we have the funding. We're able to do things, to establish relationships, to expand exhibits, etc. So this memory of the Holodomor is a key part of what's going on in the story in Ukraine today. As Russian forces are streaming in, there are plenty of people that remember this genocide, that talk about this genocide, and that use it as motivation to fight off another sort of round of Russian domination. That said, there is another side to the coin of genocide in the Ukraine, and it's one that I think we as Americans are not aware of. It's one that we need to understand, again, if we want to understand why is it that so many Russians would see what's going on in the Ukraine today and say, that's legitimate, there is a need to denazify the country. And the reason why is because Ukrainians aren't the only ones with memory of genocide. We have a tendency to think about genocide in World War II specifically as a Jewish-German experience or a relationship. The Germans, or the Nazis if you prefer, decided to kill the Jews. They did. The Jews were the ones on the receiving end of it. And that's the basic core story of the Holocaust, right? If I go and watch Schindler's List, if I read any type of books like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, right, the narrative there is Germans or Nazis bad, Jews victims. But the nature of genocide in World War II, especially in Eastern Europe, is much more complicated than that. It is not just the story of Nazis killing Jews, but there are other people that are involved, both as perpetrators and as, in some cases, victims. One of the things that happens as the Germans roll into the Soviet Union in 1941 is Ukrainians there look at the Germans as potential liberators. At least some Ukrainians do. Some Ukrainians see the Germans as someone that might support a potential Ukrainian state, as they did in living memory with the previous generation during World War I. And so Ukrainian nationalists will actively collaborate with German authorities in the hope that they will be able to create an independent state after the war. Significant numbers of Ukrainians volunteer to become police officers, later participating sometimes in mass shooting events or serving as concentration camp guards. One of the things you'll find in the history of what happened is that there were a lot of these things called Hiwis. These are people that are helping the Germans, again, serving as guards, policemen, helping create the order that is necessary for the Germans to continue the war. Now, why do they do this? Some are anti-Semitic. Some associate Jews with communism and look at this as an opportunity to get revenge. Some just want a paycheck, right? World War II is not a great time for economic innovation in the Ukraine. The Nazis will pay you. The Nazis will give you a role of authority, will give you a position that you will have a claim to food, perhaps over others. You're certainly useful to them. Another thing that's going on here is that there is a historical tension between Poles in the area and Ukrainians in the area. Those two nations kind of, where the borders come together, where they overlap each other, there's a little bit of struggle that goes on there. And so in the middle of World War II, as the Germans and Russians are fighting each other, there are Ukrainians and Poles that decide this is an opportune time for them to go after each other. And so you will have Poles becoming German police, not because they believe in the German cause, but because then they're protected and they can begin to wield that authority against Ukrainians, and of course, vice versa. Now, of course, this is World War II, so the situation is going to get very complicated, and I don't have time to go into all the dimensions of it. There's actually two different Ukrainian nationalist movements. They start fighting each other. Sometimes they work with the Germans, sometimes they work against the Germans. After the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, when basically you have the surrender of a major German army, the Germans lose about 600,000 soldiers. All of a sudden, it becomes fairly obvious Germany's not going to win this war. And so you have large numbers of Ukrainians then that go over to the partisans. Partisans are kind of pro-communist fighters. They're going to fight behind the line. They're going to be saboteurs. They're going to try to do what they can to resist German occupation. So you have Ukrainians that are in nationalist organizations. You have Ukrainians that are collaborating with the Germans. You have Ukrainians that are in the Red Army or they're in partisan units. Meanwhile, as the Germans are starting to lose the war, they start to say, okay, is there any other people that we can call up who we can use as fresh bodies to fight the war? And so they end up creating this Waffen-SS unit. The SS are basically a paramilitary force. The Waffen-SS is like an elite military unit, but they're not under the command of the regular German army. They're under the command of Heinrich Himmler. 80,000 Ukrainians will join this Waffen-SS in the hopes not that it's going to support the German cause, but they think it will form the basis of a new Ukrainian national army. Now, in the end, these Waffen-SS units are defeated. But the memory is a complicated one in Ukraine today, where they are often seen not as perpetrators of genocide, but as national heroes. Consider the case of someone like Stepan Bandera. He was the leader of one of the main Ukrainian nationalist organizations called the OUN during the war. This organization commits ethnic cleansing against Poles, participates, one could argue, in genocide. In 2006, his body is transferred to a special cemetery outside of Lviv, which built a statue for him in 2007. In 2010, the outgoing president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, the guy who's supposed to be pro-Western, pro-democracy, the guy who, seems more aligned with Europe, Yushchenko awarded Bandera the Medal of the Hero of Ukraine. This is like one of the highest medals, if not the highest medal, that one can be awarded. This is the medal right now that's being given out to certain people that are fighting the Russians today in Ukraine, that are sacrificing their lives. Right? There's the famous story of these 13 sailors on Snake Island, and the Russian warship is like surrender, and they're just like, Russian warship, go F yourself. And they've all been awarded this Hero of the Ukraine medal. Why is Yushchenko giving someone like Bandera, guy with a lot of blood on his hands, a Hero of the Ukraine medal? I bring all this back to this talk that Vladimir Putin has right now when he starts going about, we've got to get rid of the fascists, we've got to get rid of the Banderites in the Ukraine. When he's talking about that, what he means is dealing with the significant numbers of Ukrainians who still have positive views of Bandera or his wartime memory. And Russian propaganda focuses heavily on this guy, Bandera, as being the representative of a modern democratic Ukraine. Now, Bandera is not universally celebrated. There are people that are very aware of the crimes he committed. There are people, significant numbers of people in the Ukraine who have denounced him. This medal that he was awarded has been rescinded. But how much of a movement needs to be there for you to use it for propaganda purposes? How many pictures of Ukrainians giving Nazi salutes or, again, this historical record that exists, how much of that do you need in order to put it on Russian state TV and convince people that, this is still going on today? Okay, so far we've covered a lot of ground. We've identified a lot of the causes of the current conflict. Before we end, I just want to briefly address one factor that's been heavily discussed in popular media, but which I would actually argue plays only a tangential role in the conflict. And that is actually the idea of NATO expansion. To put this simply, right, there's this argument, well, NATO is the one that's been expanding, NATO is the one that's putting pressure on Russia, and so basically Putin had to do this because he couldn't allow NATO to expand onto literally Russia's doorstep. This is a propaganda talking point. To again simplify a more complicated story, the elements of this, the center of it, the sort of foundations of it, you have to go all the way back to 1989-90 as communism is falling apart in Eastern Europe. And at that point, as they are trying to negotiate this and not start World War III, there is a kind of tacit kind of deal done between the West and between Mikhail Gorbachev, where the West says Germany is going to reunify, Germany is going to stay a part of NATO, but that's it. We're not going to go any farther. Why would we need to? However, geopolitical realities overtake this promise. By the early 1990s, for reasons that are very understandable today, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, they want to become a part of NATO. They want to become a part of Europe. And it's a lot easier to coordinate your armies than it is to coordinate your economy. So NATO becomes a really easy way for countries to join quote-unquote Europe without having to go through all the economic stuff first. Later on, by the time you get to the late 90s, early 2000s, other countries will begin to join, will join not just NATO, but also the EU. Now again, if you're in the Baltic states, if you're in a place like Romania or Bulgaria, it's not that NATO is putting pressure on you to join. You want to be part of NATO. You have a history of being invaded by the Russians. You have a history, 1956 in Hungary, 1968 in Czechoslovakia, of the Russians doing exactly what they are doing in Ukraine today. As I mentioned before, as this process plays out, at various times, Ukraine has asked to join NATO. They have negotiated. They've said, look, let's do a deal. Let's be part of it. We would like to have protection against a Russian invasion. The first attempt to join NATO was abandoned in 2004, but then Viktor Yushchenko kind of restarts the efforts in 2005. In 2008, there was a lot of talk of the potential of Ukraine joining NATO. NATO actually does not offer Ukraine a direct kind of action plan, if you will, to get in. They kind of say, yeah, essentially someday you'll probably be in NATO, but we're not in any hurry about this, and we don't want to offend Russia. We don't want to push Russia into a corner or to make them feel like we're hostile. Now, needless to say, the invasion of Georgia in 2008 by Russia, the seizure of Crimea in 2014, have reawakened desires in Ukraine to be a part of NATO. NATO's hesitation has been the desire not to provoke a war with Russia. And yet, having backed off Ukrainian membership, having kind of downplayed it, we're still here, right? The center part of the problem isn't that NATO wants to, get close to Russia, or that NATO is pushing some kind of close relationship with Ukraine. The central problem is that for Russia and for Vladimir Putin in particular, Ukraine cannot be allowed to leave the Russian orbit. Ukraine cannot be allowed to have an independent existence because they don't see Ukraine as being something separate than Russia. Okay. I wish we had more time to get into all of this. There's obviously lots and lots of history. I teach a class on Russian history. We could spend hours upon hours talking about how all these events play out. But I want to leave you with a couple thoughts as we go through these incredible times. The first observation that I want to make is that we really need to recognize the role of history in this conflict. Narratives of Putin the madman are fun and easy to understand, but as I've said, they vastly underestimate the forces leading to the current crisis. Consider, for example, a comment made by then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev in 2009 to Ukrainian leaders. Quote, Russian-Ukrainian relations are tested by your administration's review of our general historical framework, glorification of Nazi collaborators, the exaltation of the role of radical nationalists, and attempts to press the international community into supporting nationalist interpretations of the 1932-33 famine in the USSR as a genocide against the Ukrainian people. End quote. These are essentially the same grievances expressed by Putin today to justify the war in Ukraine. And while I as an historian would reject their framing, it's not hard to see why some Russians wouldn't. If we're talking about winning the information war, right, we have to understand again, for Russians, when someone like Dmitry Medvedev says those things, look, he's talking about the Holodomor. He's talking about Bandera. He's talking about the OUN. He's talking about history. Second, at the heart of the matter remains the question of Russia's relationship with the former states of the Soviet Union. Is Ukraine independent, or does it cede its sovereignty to Russia? I don't know that there's a really good way to square that circle, and I hope that the politicians involved in trying to end the current war don't use the model that was developed by the Dayton Accords, which is basically what ended the war in Bosnia in 1995. I don't want to get sidetracked into a whole nother discussion or even podcast episode, but Bosnia is basically still a mess some 25 years later, in part because the solution that was developed was to ethnicize territory. Partitioning Ukraine is a terrible idea. Better to go with the post-World War II solution, which was to move people rather than borders, only perhaps this time do it voluntarily. If ethnic Russians do not feel safe in Ukraine today, then perhaps there's a way to support them going to live in Russia. But the idea that you're going to create autonomous zones based on ethnicity, based on language, it's very hard to determine who is in control of what area. There's a long history about this. I wrote a book on it. It's a bad idea. A third observation, and perhaps the most important part of the peace process, has to figure out what the relationship is between Europe and Russia. So long as Russia stands outside of Europe, the basic structure of European politics would seem to invite tension. While I don't for a second think that NATO would envision some sort of attack on Russia, the quarrels over spheres of influence seem likely. But how do you bring Russia into Europe so long as it is governed by an autocrat and it embraces illiberalism? My hope would be that one day we see the same sorts of transformations in Russia that we have seen in Eastern Europe, although the rise of autocracy in Poland and Hungary does give me pause. Perhaps, however, the end of this crisis will see the downfall of Putin. And if it does, I would hope that we in the West would approach the situation more like the end of World War II than we did the end of the Cold War, actively and positively supporting the rebuilding of Russian society and the Russian economy. This leads me to a final related observation, which is that I know part of the reason we listen to podcasts like this is that we want to know what will happen and where things are going. We study the past because we want certainty about the future. In the present situation, I'm afraid any predictions I could make would only be pure speculation. It's easy to imagine a future where the Ukrainian people hold out, where the Russian army or the Russian people or both mutiny and overthrow Putin. We're talking about Russian history here. There's a long history of mutinies in the army and them destabilizing the political system. Of course, it's equally easy to imagine the opposite, where the sheer number of forces overcome Ukrainian resistance, where the result is a bloody subjugation of a nation and of its political and cultural leaders. We've seen this movie before in Eastern Europe after World War II, but also during World War II. There's a big incident that happens after the Soviets seize Poland. They arrest about 10,000 officers, they march them out into a place called Katyn, and they shoot them all and they bury them. And there are reports that something like Katyn could happen again today in the Ukraine. Of course, with so many NATO forces so close by, with everyone on high alert and the lines between war and shadow so blurred, it's also not hard to envision how one misguided missile or troop movement starts World War III. In the end, all we can go by is to live in the moment and to try to understand and to try to mitigate the causes of the war as best we can. Okay, that's all I have for you for this special edition of History Off the Page. If you've enjoyed this podcast, or if you found it useful, then I'd ask that you make a small donation to a charity related to the war in Ukraine. I don't want to name specific charities now because this is a podcast. The needs that people have in Ukraine today might differ, tomorrow when you hear this, or a week from now, or a year from now. So what I'm going to do is post a list of reputable charities on my website, which is www.historyoffthepage.com. I'll also try to tweet some out on Twitter. I'll post them on Facebook and Instagram. But I think that the best thing that we can do right now is to try to help the people of Ukraine, because regardless of what side you kind of position yourself on, or if you're on any side at all, the reality is that there are bombs and shells and bullets being fired in these cities. There are ordinary people that are suffering from the war that's going on. Millions of lives of ordinary people are being ruined. And so if there's some small sacrifice that we can make to help make their lives even just a little bit better, right, I think that's worth it. Okay, so that's all for now. I hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.